Okay, so welcome everyone to the next session. It gives me great pleasure to moderate this session, which is on applying behavioral insights to financial, social inclusion, behavioral economics, and nudge in the Arab region. My name is Charlotte Cuddam, as I was graciously introduced. For this session, I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the format. What we're going to do is I'm going to introduce each of our esteemed speakers. Then each of our speakers is going to speak for between 6 to 8 minutes. And then we've built in ample time to ask questions and interact with the audience. So we'll have about 25 minutes to do that. And then we will go back to each of the speakers for some concluding thoughts. Just to focus a little bit today on what our session is going to, the umbrella sort of themes. We're going to focus on how behavioral insights can help improve effectiveness of social and humanitarian programs. Of course, we have heard today and yesterday a number of behavioral interventions that have been tested in some areas of social policy, such as employment and financial inclusion. We add to these, but also we are going to be exploring some of the opportunities of applying behavioral insights in other areas, such as specifically humanitarian work that have recently been explored and tested rigorously. This session will explore lessons learned from both successful as well as unsuccessful behavioral interventions, and I think that that's really quite important for us to explore together some of the frustrations in trying to apply some of these interventions. The panelists will reflect on on the opportunities to apply behavioral insights to inclusion policies and the challenges and, as I said, frustrations in doing so. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction of each of our panelists altogether. So with us here today, by way of introduction, we have 4 speakers. We begin with Jennifer Colville from the UNDP in the Arab States. She is the regional team leader on innovation at the Bureau of Policy and Program Support. She's based in Oman. She works with colleagues and partners in 18 countries across the region in exploring and experimenting with new, emerging, and alternative approaches to development, including behavioral insights as well as big data, games for social change, and alternative forms of financing. Very excited to have you, Jennifer. We have, as our second speaker, Josh Martin, who we introduced earlier today, but for those of you who weren't in the Rule of Law session, I will repeat. So Josh is the Vice President of Ideas for 2. He is responsible for overseeing behavioral science intervention programs in diverse fields, from domestic financial aid reform to international livelihood programs. Prior to joining Ideas for 2, Josh was a policy advisor in Côte d'Ivoire's Ministry of Planning and Development, having previously held posts at Cordoba Initiative and Princeton University's Empirical Studies of Conflict Program and consulting roles at the World Bank, USAID, and many, many others. Daniel Shepard is a member and the board of trustees at Nudge Lebanon, former member of the White House Social and Behavioral Science team. Daniel, great to have you. Daniel is also the president of the Implementation Science and Communication Strategies Group. He is an affiliate of both the United States Office of Evaluation Sciences and Nudge 4 Solutions. Prior to his current position, he was a member of the White House Social and Behavioral Science team. I think I just said that, but there it is again, just to highlight. And then finally, last but not least, we have Amara Kamish, who is the Director of Policy Research and Analysis at the Western Cape Government in Cape Town, South Africa. Amara's exposure to behavioral insights was through a joint research project between Ideas for 2, the University of Cape Town's research unit in behavioral economics and neuroeconomics called Rubin, and the Western Cape Government. She is interested in how behavioral insights can influence policy development and implementation, particularly as it relates to providing for basic human rights in South Africa. So thank you all very much for being with us today. We're going to now turn to each of the panelists who are going to share some of their experiences. And just as a way of reminder, each will present for about 6 to 8 minutes. Thank you, Jennifer.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, thank you so much to Nudge Lebanon Fadi for convening and for inviting me to share our experiences. I'm very excited to be on a panel that talks about inclusion as a representative of the United Nations Development Program. This is at the heart of what we do, and in fact at the heart of the Sustainable Development Agenda, Agenda 2030. Lori introduced it earlier today. Agenda 2030 has 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and a key principle of that agenda that's been universally adopted around the world is leave no one behind. And so we see the agenda and our support for countries and national partners. We see an opportunity to use behavioral insights as a way to realize this agenda and to really focus on including those who could potentially or who are left behind now. So we see opportunities to nudge governments in the way they form policies that can reach out to those on the periphery, those who don't have access to or ready access to social services or access to finance, those who are victims of violence, those who are on the periphery or margin, literally and figuratively. That there are ways to include them in the process in the process of development by using behavioral insights. It's also very exciting to me to have listened to the conversations earlier, particularly when there were a number of people talking about how behavioral insights kind of can be reinforced or can be made even more strong by connecting it to other types of innovation methodologies such as design thinking or data science and big data. I'm coming from the perspective not as a behavioral scientist, but as a development practitioner who is looking to kind of cause trouble by bringing new approaches to our national partners. And we very much see the connection of design thinking with behavioral insights in the mix together so that we can better understand what the nature of the issues are and then be able to design interventions that might be able to address those issues. As UNDP, we started looking at behavioral insights 2013, 2014, and we started with issues that I guess I'll call more straightforward issues. We started in Moldova, looking at the issue of adherence to medical protocol amongst tuberculosis patients. And we partnered with the UK Behavioral Insights team and designed a series of randomized control trials to understand how we might be able to get people to actually adhere to taking the daily medication that was required. They'd have to do it take the medication in front of a medical practitioner, and the adherence rates were very low, and so we kind of dissected the process, how this actually happens. And there were a number of options that we wanted to test, and one of them was to actually allow this to be done via remotely over the phone, so basically by video conference on your phone. And we tested this out, and the adherence rates went from 40% to 80%. And it sounds so simple, but if we hadn't kind of gone through the process of understanding what the barriers were and understanding their constraints, the user constraint, in this case tuberculosis patients, we never would have gotten to that kind of a solution. So we kind of started with this adherence to medical protocol. We were doing some things in China around recycling of electronic waste, using peer pressure and testing out different messages to get people to increase the recycling rates of their electronic waste. And we thought, okay, we like behavioral insights. We're seeing change in behavior. We're seeing immediate results. It's easy to measure the impact of these interventions that we're supporting partners in implementing. So we said, okay, we're the innovation group within UNDP. Let's expand a little bit. Let's look at some other issues. And in the Arab states in particular, we decided to tackle the issue of violence. So somebody asked earlier, are there more complex behavioral issues that you might be able to look at? So we decided to look at gender-based violence, violence against and amongst children, and violent extremism. And yeah, we've really gotten ourselves into it. We're just getting kind of started with looking at these issues of violence and how we might be able to disrupt the process of violence in these different contexts. And it's a beast. It's incredibly complex. It's incredibly difficult to parse and understand. To be able to understand how we can actually make a difference. We know that we can make a difference or design interventions for various drivers of violence, whether it's, say, access to employment opportunities or reduced corruption or sense of community belonging. And we are putting together interventions in these areas, but how do we know if that's actually disrupting the process of violent extremism, for example? So just to give a few examples, we have in Egypt, we're working with the Ministry of Social Solidarity to look at violence against and amongst children. We're working with the UK Behavioral Insights team to understand the different drivers of violence in this context, how it is that children are acting out against one another, how caretakers are violent against against children. We've come up with a number of different options that we think we might be able to test, or reasons, drivers of this kind of violence that we want to test. And we'll be putting together a number of initiatives that really focus on increased sense of agency for both the caretaker as well as the children, and we'll be testing that out in the coming months. We're also looking at, in Egypt as well as in South Africa and Georgia, we're looking at gender-based violence and how we might be able to increase the use of national social services for victims of gender-based violence, to encourage them to take more advantage of these services that are available for them. So we're looking at a number of different kind of points of entry where we might be able to affect their behavior and uptake. One is we're looking at the distribution of utility bills. So they're sent out to households around the country. We can separate this by city or by governorate and test different messages about making it more kind of easier and a little bit more under the radar to find out information about the social services that are available for people who have been victims of gender-based violence. And then the most recent one and the biggest, kind of hardest one for us is the issue of preventing violent extremism. We're working with Nudge Lebanon in Sudan, Tunisia, and Yemen to look at how we can disrupt this process. In Sudan, in particular, we're looking at two communities, maybe three, we'll see, but one is prisoner population. So people who, the prison population is an area that is very, what's the right word, susceptible to becoming radicalized. And so we're trying to figure out ways to augment the work that they're already doing to help people kind of be able to reintegrate into society and get back into society without these radicalized ideas. So right now they're working with imams, but we want to bring in peers who have been through this process already, who had been radicalized, who had then been in prison and now are back in community, and offer them as kind of peer support, or have this peer support mechanism to kind of give a lifeline to those in prison who might feel susceptible to radicalization. We're also working with young entrepreneurs, so there was a question before about entrepreneurship. We want to help young entrepreneurs more than we already are in that we have lots of innovation challenges, entrepreneurship challenges that we support, and in Sudan in particular, we get a lot of interest, but we don't have programs that serve all of those who apply but aren't able to get in, and so now we're looking at ways to use behaviorally informed interventions to create networks amongst themselves and help them kind of support themselves and create a community amongst themselves to be able to kind of move forward with their entrepreneurial aspirations without necessarily having tapped into the kind of the broader program that we've been able to offer with our national partners. Happy to share more details, just to say that the challenges that we have are that we've got kind of technical issues around how can you, sometimes we're inhibited from sending out SMS messages by the government, the ethics issues of capacitating governments to use these kind of approaches, and then I'll go into more detail in questions maybe, but thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, very much. So we're going to move to Josh. Josh is going to present some of the work at Ideas for Two, particularly I think around the behavioral design for cash delivery initiative that's recently been inaugurated across 4 sub-Saharan African countries. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks. Move this up here. So again, we're Ideas 42, so we're a nonprofit that does social impact work using behavioral science. We do most of it around the world, having grown out of the US, now mostly working in developing countries. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular on what's fast becoming the modal way, the most important, most widespread way of doing development work in general, which is cash transfers. So I'm not going to go into the history of this. Many of you probably already know it, but increasingly, instead of doing trainings or handing out goods or providing services to poor people, and what's being done is just giving them cash and letting them figure out how they want to procure their own needs. That's a really important, I think, development and evolution in the way that policymaking is done in developing countries and also in the humanitarian world more and more. If you think about it, we're giving cash to people, and yet most of the focus so far on this cash has been on the back end, on what you might call the supply side or the program side. So how do we prevent cash from leaking when it goes into the hands of the people who actually pay it? How do you prevent corruption? How do you technologize the process? How do you make it more efficient, scalable, all of that? And that's all been great. But what we're proposing is that we focus instead on the people. Or not instead, but in addition, right? Complementary, not supplementary, on the people. And the reason is because if we're trying to provide this money to people and empower them in a very direct way to make their own decisions, we should be able to also help them. We have a responsibility, in fact, to help them make the decisions that they themselves want to make and translate those into the actions that they want to make. And so how can programs do that better and become more effective? And so I just threw this up there because if you've already read Nudge and you're looking for a second book to read on behavioral economics, one I would recommend to you is Scarcity. The first guy with the long name, Sendel, is one of Ideas 42's co-founders. And this is a fantastic book. And what it does is it sort of takes the idea behind behavioral science and it applies it in a very deep way to a specific phenomenon of poverty. So what happens when you are living from day to day in a state of constant need? What happens to your cognition? And what is found through many experiments, I won't go into them here, but basically being poor makes you dumb. It's not because you are dumb, it's because the need that you face on a regular basis, on a moment-to-moment basis, puts incredible pressure on your cognition. And it saps resources away from other tasks that require those resources in order to get done. So high-level thinking, whether it's planning or goal setting or even conceiving what a future could look like, all of these things resisting temptation, all these things require mental resources that the poor have difficulty mustering, partly because they're dedicating so much of their energy to meeting basic needs. And this is a really fundamental thing. So if you think about how a cash transfer works, first of all, these are the poorest people in society, the people who have the scarcest mental resources available to them. And what we're essentially doing when we give people cash is we're expecting, again, rational economics, that this money creates an income effect, so now their income is larger, they're able to buy more stuff, and it also empowers them, it gives them the ability to make choices they didn't have before, and that then leads to certain behaviors which are good for them in the long run. So it might be, let's say, parenting, it might be investing in a productive business that they would start or something of that nature. And this is a more general thing which is increasingly being applied to cash transfers, which is trainings and what are often called accompanying measures, so other program elements that aim to support the beneficiaries by giving them skills, essentially, and information. And so this also works through a pathway that requires support. And so what sort of things might get in the way? Well, you give people cash. So in order to do any sort of behavior with that cash, I have to make a plan. I have to set some of it aside in order to spend it on something, and I then have to avoid spending it on something I don't want to spend it on, right? Similarly, with information or skills, you have to attend the event in the first place, you have to follow through on the actions you want to do, and then you have to keep doing those things over and over again into the future if you want to get some benefit from it. And yet we assume all of this away when we design a cash transfer program. We just sort of think that by giving people money they'll be able to do these things, and we forget about the context in which they live. So the idea is that if we know something about these decisions and actions, we know how they happen and where and by whom, we can design the program in a way that can mitigate them. So that's just the theory behind why we do this. So I'm going to give you just a couple of designs without any context or background, which you can interrogate me on afterward. But this is from a program in Madagascar. And basically what we did was design a goal-setting activity for people that don't even know how to read and write. So this is essentially an illiteracy context, and we gave them these pictorial representations of different things that they might want to do with their money. And the insight here is just that people aren't even taking the time to think about what they would want to do with this cash until they get it, and of course that's way too late, because then they spend it on the first thing that comes to their mind, or they go outside the transfer center and there's a market and there's lots of vendors with cool looking things that you can buy, and of course the money goes right to those things. So creating a moment of choice where people can think about what they would want to spend it on and have a menu of options in front of them potentially leads to improvements in how people spend the money. And so people select a goal. We walk them through this exercise where then they take the goal in the form of a sticker, they put it on this other sheet, and we walk them through essentially an accounting exercise where they circle the number of bills that represent how much money they have to spend to buy this thing or do this activity, and then that then becomes what they can track again. So it's basically an accounting exercise for people who can't add, which is sort of remarkable if you think about it. And then the other thing we did is we gave them these little pouches that they can put their money in. And you might say, well, so what? They probably already were putting their money into their pocket or something. And it's true, they were. But what giving them the pouch allows them to do is to very intentionally set the money aside. So take the physical action of separating out their cash from one place to another, an action we call partitioning, from Dilip Soman's research, for example, and also from the mental accounting literature, that basically says that if you create this mental earmark, you earmark the cash for one use versus another, that has a much greater chance of persisting, and you're able to then, you think about these two pools of cash in a very different way. You create mental accounts that are essentially separate. And so we wanted to see whether this worked on getting beneficiaries to save some of their transfer money rather than spend it all immediately, which is something that they themselves said they wanted to do. And I don't have the results slide here, but if you believe me, then I'll tell you that there was an increase of 40 percentage points, so like a huge increase, like a 300x increase in savings from their transfer. So not savings overall, but savings from this one transfer payment, which is what we were working on. So we think that this has a lot of potential, and so now we're rolling this out in 3 new countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and hopefully an additional 4 countries beginning this fall. These are huge programs. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of beneficiary households, in some cases millions, in other cases like tens of millions, like Ethiopia, for example. And the potential is huge around the world. I mean, you have something like $200 or $250 million of cash that's being handed out every day to the world's poor in like physical bills. So the opportunity for these very, very light touch interventions is massive. This is my last thing. And if you think about it, this is like, what do these interventions cost? What does this cost? This entire thing, this plus this is about 70 cents. And yet these people are getting hundreds of dollars a year in cash. So with a very, very small amount of extra investment, you're able to make the impact of a cash transfer program go up tremendously, right? And that's really the theory in a general sense behind why we use nudge for public policy in general. And I think this is a great example because the alternative use of this money is so clear. It's you would just pay it to them, right? That's what you're doing anyway. But instead of paying this extra money to them, you can actually help them guide their decisions and take better actions. You can increase the effect of the program by a lot. So that's all I'll say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Josh. We move to Daniel Shepard. Daniel is going to discuss how government, nonprofit, and private sector entities can play a role in the use of behavioral insight to promote financial and social inclusion. He's going to highlight how BI has been successfully employed to expand financial inclusion with some illustrative examples.
Sure. Thank you very much. So I'm going to kind of take an approach to this where I want to talk about an area where there's lots of literature and lots of evidence that we know behavioral insights can have quite a good impact, and then highlight the importance of testing because sometimes things don't work and actually can cause harm, so we need to think carefully and always test, even if something worked 10 years ago, or at least frequently test perhaps is a better way to put it. And then lastly, kind of touch a little bit on some new avenues of work, which Jennifer has already very well highlighted, areas where there just isn't a lot known, both in terms of the problem, because they're very hard to research populations, extremists, for example, or there's not much known about the application of behavioral insights. So the first area, I think financial inclusion is one of those areas where there's lots of opportunity, cash transfers, savings accounts, retirement, pension, to apply behavioral insights, and we have quite clear ideas about what works. So just to highlight some evidence that's out there, commitments are very powerful, both in terms of having a pouch with a label on it, like Josh shared, but also in terms of having a public commitment, right? So there's been interesting work around the world done with village savings and loans associations, or ROSCAs, kind of group savings associations, which meet and try to save and then sometimes lend money to each other. And people often have some sort of savings goal, and one interesting project that just illustrates the importance of commitments and how you use behavioral insights with them was done in Colombia. So they had some village savings and loans where people said, this is my goal, education, buy a goat, whatever it might be. And they would say that privately to the research team. So this was a trial. The others would say their goal and say it publicly to the whole group. And then the meetings would continue and they would continue progressing towards their goal. And those that were in the public commitment group were 35% more likely than the control group to reach their goal, and those in the private commitment group, 17% more likely, roughly. So both of them were effective, right? But having this public commitment was even more effective. And there's a raft of examples with defaults and commitments and active choice for savings and for the use of cash. So I think that's an area where if it's not being done and if you're working in that space, you should probably reach out to some people and think about how you can apply behavioral insights, because there's quite a good amount of thinking about it. The second thing I want to talk about is how important it is to be open and honest about what works and also what doesn't work. So this is more from also experience working in government. I was asked to talk a bit about that. And I think one thing that was really important with SBST and continues throughout large dimensions of the US government is publishing everything that's done that's publicly funded research, right? And both things that worked and didn't work. And so to give you an example, when I think of inclusion, inclusion is often about there's parts of society where some people are not accessing it or not accessing it as much as we would like. Right? One of those areas is education, especially higher education among the poor families or among kind of families where maybe their parents were not accessing higher education in the context of the States. So I'll give you two examples, one that worked and one that didn't. So one was tackling the fact that about 20% of people from these kind of low-income backgrounds, when they enroll in a college, the summer happens, and when summer ends, they don't show up. Right? They don't matriculate. So Summer Melt, it's called. Ben Castleman and Paige and others have been working on this. And so what was done with SBST and Ben Castleman and others was sending messages throughout the summer to remind people of key stages of things they need to do. You need to sign up for classes, you need to pick your housing, etc. And this resulted in about a 6 percentage point increase in people enrolling in the fall. Right? These are people that are maybe often excluded from higher education. Maybe they come from a background where it's less supported and there's less people that can tell them how to navigate the process. So there you have an intervention, behavioral inform, increases enrollment. So that's been tried in other spaces. So let's say once they're there, can they stay by getting money from the government, grants and so forth? And again, about 20%, 15 to 20% of people who go to college in the States need financial aid are in good standing. They get grants, but they don't reapply in the subsequent years to keep that grant money to continue going to school, even if they have good grades and everything. And so messages were sent out to say, hey, remember you need to do your FAFSA, this very complicated form you have to do in the US to get your financial aid, so that you can rematriculate and go to school and achieve your dreams, etc. And this intervention, despite tracking it for 2 years, seemed to result in a 1 percentage point decrease in enrollment. Right? So maybe it made more salient how expensive college was. Maybe it had other mechanisms we don't know. But the thing there is just to say, here you have two interventions, both with good evidence behind them, if you kind of trust me. If you trust Josh, I hope you can also trust me. And yet you have one having quite a big positive impact on the marginalized group and one having a potential negative impact. But you could also argue it was in their best interest. Maybe the school wasn't for them and they went to trade school. We don't know. But the important thing is just don't assume everything works. And look for also those papers where it failed, because they're quite interesting sometimes to learn from. And then lastly, just to highlight an area that I think is interesting to explore beyond violent extremism and so forth, was already highlighted by Aziz soon, which is around refugees, right? There's been a lot of interesting books and papers, white papers coming out that we need a better approach to how we support refugees, how we approach humanitarian action. And then one little insight that I think is quite powerful that bridges education and support for refugee communities is that they're highly stereotyped, right, and highly stigmatized often, and that can affect your performance in school and in learning. And there's interesting work where if you reaffirm the positive values about your group, you can be more resistant to stigma and perform better in school. It's been done with African Americans, it's been done with women, and Nudge Lebanon is exploring, can you use this sort of insight to empower young people going through accelerated learning that missed 2 or 3 years of school to help them perform better and to their full potential rather than being stressed out and anxious about what's going forward. So I think there's areas where there's loads of evidence and there's almost no excuse not to be using some of these things, and then there's areas where we're figuring it out little by little but need to be careful, and areas where we don't know yet, but there's definitely room for giving it a try, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. We move to Amara Kamish. Amara is going to discuss a project running in township schools in Cape Town and how behavioral insights have been used to promote social, gender, and educational inclusion.
Thanks so much, Charlotte, and thanks again for being here today. I think from my perspective, just to sort of give you all a bit of a picture of where I fit into all of this. So I'm in the policy unit at the Department of the Premier, which is really a regional government in Cape Town, South Africa. So it's a bit different just in terms of where we sit, but I think what's really useful is that we are able to both develop policy, but then also look at how to implement that. And so what's been really interesting, and as I've been hearing and listening to various speakers, I think there is a golden thread about, context and where you find yourself. And I think that, one of the questions raised earlier was really talking about how does it work in developing countries or other countries that is not France or the UK or the US. And so I've been fortunate, or sometimes I feel unfortunate, to deal with the raft and the plethora of challenges that we face in my country. And so what we find is that context really always matters. And in the last panel, we heard that this is sort of a critical idea and critical thinking point about how you actually perceive, how you go into a community and your perceptions of what should be done as opposed to what could be done. And so for us, a lot of our testing, and we've been running BI projects since 2012 in the province, starting off with our colleagues at Ideas 42, but then sort of working with the World Bank and various other leaders in the field. And so really it's been, it's been challenging at times, and Daniel, you mentioned that it's not just about the successes, but also our challenges. And so what the challenges actually do for us is really try to think through what we are doing and why we are doing it and how we are doing it. So it's really about, when I think about examples from ours, and thinking through, what I'm going to speak about today and sort of what social inclusion means, the one thing I thought about was really thinking about, so who is excluded? So for us, it's about how do you close that opportunity gap? So sort of bringing the haves and the haves not together. And so for us, because we have a legacy of apartheid, as I'm sure you all know about, we've been stuck with a spatial legacy as well. So you have a very sort of beautiful seaside village or town in the center of the city, but then about 20 kilometers away, you'll find informal settlements. So these are like tin roof structures that people live in, and millions of people, squashed up together to really think through, how am I going to access services? How am I going to have electricity? How am I going to basically have access to the internet? So for us, it's sort of dealing with these multi-level of challenges in a way that is sustainable over time, but also are able to meet the needs of the people living in those areas. And so for us, we decided that one of the levers that we could really pull was to look at education. And so I think the previous panel is a fantastic segue into one of the projects that we've been running. And so Z mentioned something about growth mindset. And so when we embarked on this project, and we ran this, and we're still running it with the World Bank, and we've been doing it for over the past year, really thinking about, yes, we give you the math skills and give you the English skills, but what we don't give you is the resilience or growth mindset to overcome challenges which you may face. So the one thing in terms of context for us, it's about, you're not just poor. So we are working in the poorest of the poorest regions. And when you go into a school there, you're already poor, so which means that you're already disadvantaged. But then coupled with that, you have a whole raft of multidimensional poverty factors. So things like not being able to access healthcare, not being able to access quality education, not being able to have your services rendered in a way that you would normally like. So this further disadvantages you. And I think what you were saying about sort of the scarcity issue, you're not thinking about long-term planning or goals or objectives. You're thinking about, what am I going to eat tonight? How I'm going to get home from school without being shot. And, this might seem like a bit of a over-exaggeration, but if I can just set the context. So we run this project in about 21 schools in Cape Town, and they're all sort of in black township schools. And so one of the challenges that we do face is to have a plan, and a plan A and a plan B, C, and D. So within a space of 2 weeks, we had a bus strike, we had gang violence, we had a shooting incident at a school. So which means that as much as we planned for running an RCT within those schools, we just couldn't. So these are the things that you really need to take into consideration when working in a developing country context, that things happen on the fly, and you need to be ready and able to really grasp that. So I think that, working in various contexts gives you an idea of what may work, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what is going to work. Also, the other important thing for us is really about understanding who your target population is. So I think the one thing for us is really trying to understand without trying to contaminate your sample. But I think it's really about looking at those around you. And I think some of the panels that spoke earlier talked about this briefly, where you're actually looking at what's happening around your sort of test subject and who's being affected. So for us, going into a school doesn't just mean the learners or the kids that we're working with, but it's also their teachers, it's the principal, it's their parents, it's the caregivers, and how that can affect them. So when we started with growth mindset, and we were really encouraged, and it's also this thing about blended learning and what it actually means for us. So a lot of our kids don't know how to use a computer or a tablet. So this is the first thing. Are they digitally literate? So that's the very, very first thing. Go back to the basics. Find out, what are you actually working with? Because I think not understanding that context really puts you a bit on the back foot. And then the second thing really is about understanding, what do they really want? So do they actually want to be sort of dealing with tablets? And what we found is that we actually ran this study with sort of grades 1 to 4, so primary school kids, and grades 8 to 10 in the high school setting. And we had about 700 young people within the 20 schools. And what we did find is that a lot of the younger kids didn't really understand or know how to use a tablet. So it's about, switching it on. This is the on button, switch it on here, and this is how you click through. So those small things, but you'll be amazed at how quickly those young learners actually get to grips with how to use things. And this, again, opens up a world of opportunities that they would have never experienced at home. So their parents most likely don't know how to use a computer. Their siblings possibly don't know either. So it's really about, taking that, it's again about opportunity gaps, making that gap smaller. And so for us, whether it's education, whether it's health, whether it's anything that you're really thinking about, is thinking through how you can really close that gap. And so some of the things that we've also learned and how it sort of links back to social inclusion is about a lot of the young girls. So we spoke earlier about cultural norms, social norms. A lot of sort of black township kids don't really understand that you can, as a woman, you are able to become an engineer. You are able to become a coder. You can go into those predominantly male-dominated fields without feeling that sort of strain or stress of not being able to perform. And so that was one of the main things that came through our study as well. So we basically did a sort of a 5 video clips, and that was our treatment group. So there was this animated feature, and he was known as Mojo. So Mojo is the sort of character that sort of appears on our young people's screens, and it basically talks about how do you overcome challenges, and how do you see your brain as a muscle. And so your intelligence is not fixed, but it sort of can change over time if you practice it. Why this is useful and sort of why this is important is that it's not only related to academic outcomes, because that's really been our goal. So how do you use growth mindset to sort of increase your academic outcomes in a school society? But someone mentioned something about teachers. So we focused on learners in this instance, but what's more important is about how you get the educator and the school system roped into this growth mindset to talk about difficult issues, like race, like class, diversity. So, and I think most of you know that South Africa is a very diverse country. We have many races, many different colors, many religions as well. And it's really about being able to broach those topics that can be sensitive. And I think even in an Arab setting, it's about cultural norms, and trying to push that. So what are women able to do, and what are men able to do? And sort of pushing the boundaries about what is possible and what's feasible. And so what we really found is we need to almost de-bias so many people. And even if we look at our educators in the schooling system, so a lot of them have their own biases that they come into the school system with. And so why this is negative is because that gets translated or sort of transferred over to the young people. So even if you're dealing with a grade 3 learner or a grade 4 learner, they learn that. So culture is learned, and it's about routine, but it's also about how do you break that, and how do you actually elevate things to a greater level. And I think that this is one of the challenges, but also the greatest opportunities for us, because you can really take that and sort of make it into your own and create a new cultural and social norm. So then just to wrap up, for us, growth mindset is one tool, but it can be any tool. And so the main 2 takeaways I can sort of give you now is just to say that context does definitely matter. Think through your definition phase. What is your problem? What is the problem that you want to solve? And also, what are the unintended consequences by making a policy decision? And then I think the other thing is about thinking through how this all mashes up together, so that you design an intervention that is contextually appropriate, but also culturally appropriate, so that it's not just something that's made in space, but something that has been talked about with your target or with your community. And don't see it as a test. Don't see it as a trial, because these are real people. It's real people's lives, and I think that this is where the ethics plays such an important role. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amara. So thank you to our panelists, and I think we're going to open up to the audience for questions. We have the mics, I believe, going around. So there's there and there. So may we go to the gentleman at the top, please? If you could just introduce yourself, but also if you have a specific question for a specific speaker, if you could mention their name, and if it's to everyone or more than one, mention that as well.
Sure. This is Saad Al-Khayas from Kuwait, marketing industry, incorporating nudging into communication campaigns. My question is for both Josh and Jennifer. So I'll start with Jennifer. You mentioned disrupting violence, and my question is about sustaining these behavior programs, and just in comparison, if we introduce a behavior intervention versus empowering the communities, the vulnerable communities, to take upon these challenges. I think you mentioned something about peer support, and how did that result and differ from a third-party intervention that you tested in the field? So if I can just ask Josh one question. I saw that you invested a lot in understanding the poor community to come up with such interventions. My question is, under Ideas 42, sometimes when coming from marketing background, segmentation goes a long way. So if you segment a specific audience and you understand them more, then you can come up with innovative interventions. Do we have that segmentation within behavioral design? So as a specific nudge unit that is focusing on a vulnerable community, on violence, on poverty, will that work? Just a couple of questions, an idea that I just put forward. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll take another question here in the lady.
Yes, I was interested in this concept of social distance from the researcher and the population you're working with. So,
could you just say who you're asking the
sorry.
question to, please, and introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Catherine Skank-Iglesias. I'm a demographer, but also public health area. So for Ideas 42, maybe, and anyone that has insight on this, but for example, if you can look at middle-class Americans or middle-class, and you can see, for example, they spend a lot of money on their house, but they have unmet needs for healthcare. So there's, in the public health sphere, they're doing willingness to pay research on, will they go? And you talked about earmarking and partitioning in very low resource settings. So is it easier for a researcher to go to a place where there is a social distance versus, let's say, working in our own cultures and trying to get people to partition money more, what we might call more rationally? And how do we start to look at people that are very near to us? Also, you mentioned the speaker from Cape Town, you mentioned about biases. And again, there could be a lot of people we know socially that have biases. Is it easier to deal with biases when there's a social distance from us and we're dealing with another target population we're working with versus our own peers?
Thank you. We'll take one more question, the woman in the front.
Thank you. Rima from the Central Bank. Actually, I have a request for everybody at the panel. Since it's financial and social inclusion, I would like you to tell us, to give us, beside the work you're doing yourself, who are the best two others that you would like us to look for what they've done in this, because like financial and social inclusion is very, very important for us, and we're really looking to be inspired, especially if you have experiences for people that have done this in fragile state economies context. If not, any two nominations from you for best practices beside yourselves. Thank you so much for an interesting panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we turn to...
So the question from Kuwait about the sustainability of the interventions. First of all, I'll say that all of the work that we're doing around violence, gender-based violence, violent extremism, is super new. So I'm going to have to come back to you because we haven't been able to measure the impact yet. We're just in the process of doing a lot of these interventions in the countries that I mentioned. So we don't have results yet. I'll say that I think we're very aware of the fact that it could be that the effects that we get are based on the fact that there's an intervention, and how might we be able to design the intervention so that it'll stick when the intervention is not there. So we're trying to incorporate that, but I don't have an answer for you yet. And then I'll just pick up on the question about fragile states. Is all the work that we're doing around violent extremism is in those contexts. So, well, not all of the work, but we're working in Yemen right now and looking at how we can disrupt this process of radicalization. We're working with local actors to look at kinds of programs that they're offering around psychosocial support to people who have been exposed to violence, which in that case is basically pretty much the entire population. And so designing interventions that will get them to use the services that we're offering or the local community is offering to help them in this context. But it is very, as our colleague said from Cape Town, it's very context specific, and we're working with national partners. It's not something that we're designing kind of externally at all. But we're hoping that the interventions will be just as they'll be just as receptive to the interventions as anybody else would be.
Josh?
Great. So just on the how we do market segmentation or market analysis in behavioral science, every discipline has its own terms. What we try to do is, and again, this goes back to the circles diagram that you've now seen from both me and Lori, and we'll probably see it again, is define the problem, okay? And what we mean by that, first and foremost, is figure out what behavior you're trying to affect. But like Lori said, you also need to figure out which population has the greatest influence over that behavior. So not necessarily who's doing it, but who also is around them, who you can access, who plausibly has power over the target population. And so that process is critical, and that obviously includes a lot of techniques that I think you might point to as a marketing person from market segmentation. We could go into that a lot more, but I guess I'll go on. The question around social distance, I think, is really interesting. I would just say, I don't have a ton to say on that. I would just say that behavioral science at its root is about empathy, I think, at least applied behavioral science. So it's about being able to take a walk in someone else's shoes and imagine what their world is like. Now, that's obviously going to be hard if you come from somewhere that's far away in economic, social, and physical distance. And yet, there are techniques that have been developed that allow one to do that. And so we borrow techniques, for example, from anthropology, from cultural anthropology, where you dig really deep into what people do. You observe, you ask certain questions, but not others, that are intended to get to the bottom of what people are doing and why they might be doing it. And we learn from the science. We try to observe the context. And I think this can be an often misunderstood point, but I think is important, is that the human behavior is different in different places, but the fundamental drivers of behavior have to be universal, because our brains are all constituted the same way. So it may be that our brains develop in different ways as a function of the place we're in, but we have to believe that the fundamental drivers of behavior are similar across societies. And that means that if we know something about the science, we can make a pretty good inference, not perfect, but a pretty good inference about how people might behave if we can observe them in their context and we know what we're looking for. So that's fraught in a lot of ways that you might imagine, but I think that's nevertheless true, or at least has been proved true by a lot of the work in the field. Very last thing, two other people who are good at this type of work. One person I've already mentioned, Betsy Levy-Pollock, I think has done a lot of really fascinating and frontline stuff, which she's recently been recognized with the MacArthur Genius Grant. You could look at her stuff in Rwanda, for example, on social norms and genocide, and also in Nigeria around violence as well. And all of that has a strong inclusion angle. I think I would just really recommend anyone who hasn't checked out her work to go ahead and do so. And then there's lots of other people we could talk about, but in the research world, and one thing that I'm a big fan of on the financial side, there's this whole world of financial literacy, which you'll often find talked about as a first choice intervention for anything that relates to financial and money management. But there's this whole literature on heuristics, which are rules of thumb that show that essentially you can replace a good amount of the effect of teaching someone about financial management simply just by giving them a rule of thumb. Like, what if you take your business income and put it in one drawer and take your personal income and put it in another drawer. Guess what? That results in money management practices that are on par with a training session that would go for like 12 weeks and cost a lot more money, right? And so I would point you in the direction of Antoinette Shor's research, which sort of founded this area of inquiry. There's a number of other researchers who are working on it now, and I think CGAP also is really pushing the boundary of that type of work as well. So I would just point you in that direction.
Thank you. Daniel, do you have?
So I'll just share two reflections that touch on the question. So one is about both the idea of segmentation, but also maybe the social distance question. And I think like many areas of sort of applied research, effective projects come from teams with different backgrounds, both in terms of geographically, right? Are they from the location? Do they work in the space? Are they delivering the service? So they really know the kind of bottlenecks in it, but also having people with different academic expertise, different disciplines, like Lori mentioned. So, no one person can be expert in it all, and I think it's folly to try to be, so it's good to make sure to build these sorts of teams. And it's productive to have cross-country collaborations because you learn from each other in both directions. And then regarding kind of recommendations that, like Josh said, there's probably a Rolodex of people that are interesting, but I fully recommend interesting financial work being done by these guys. Ideas 42 actually has some really neat kind of guidance documents on the application of BI to financial inclusion and financial use of products and stuff like this. But also I'd recommend, if you're looking for kind of research partners, Dean Carlin does really interesting stuff around financial inclusion in particular, and if you're looking for kind of broader implementation in difficult circumstances, maybe humanitarian work, there's a group at NYU called Global Ties that's doing interesting work, including they're collaborating with BIT on their work in refugee camps. So those are a couple, but there are many good entities.
Thank you. Amara.
I think just in response to the social distance, again, it seems to be the flavor of the day. But I think it's really, for us, it's always been difficult in a sense that we've had to really understand who we're working with. So we've sort of taken a rule in our unit that we spend at least one day a week in the townships. So we go out there and we talk to people and we hear from them, because really that's the only way. So I wouldn't understand what it feels like to live in a township. So the best thing we can do is actually going there and speaking with them. Actually, it's not that bad. So it's sort of breaking down this whole researcher target population idea, or in my opinion, fallacy. Because actually we're all the same, and I think that your point is, correct, that we all share similar human behaviors. We might just think of things differently based on where we're sitting, but I think that we all want to be respected. We all have this idea that what I'm doing is important, and I want others to know that. And we all want to feel as though there's some level of equality and equity. And so for us, that's really trying to understand how to really understand who you're working with. You have to talk to them. Building a relationship, whether it's professionally or in your research environment, is so critical. Without that, you can't actually implement or think through or design or define any problem. And so we've tried to do this, and it is tough because we are a team of 4, but it does mean commitment. And I think we've actually used a behavioral tool where we actually make commitments with each other, and we say we are paid on X day to go out and speak to people. And we inevitably do actually keep to those commitments, because that's part of what the nudge is all about, like making future plans together and sticking to your commitments. And so that has really helped us. So as a tool, that could be something you could employ to just, get out there, get your feet dirty and just see what's out there and work with that. And I think for your question about sort of leading scholars in the field, I don't have sort of specific recommendations, but what I can say, I do obviously love the work of Ideas 42. I think that they've done exceptional work in various areas, whether it's financial inclusion or social inclusion. And so the nice thing, and I'm not punting for your organization, but maybe it's some free adverts, but just to say, what I really like about the model is that they take the time to come out and speak to the client and immerse themselves into the country context. And so this is critical. So whether you're working in Asia or whether you're working in Africa or anywhere else in the world, I think this is one of the things that I can't actually stress enough. Get to know your client and actually make the time and the effort to do that.
Thank you. We're going to take a few more questions from the audience. We'll start with Raghida at the top, and then we'll go across to the gentleman in the front. Raghida.
Hello. Raghida Jaber. I work in policy, actually. I worked in Lebanon for almost 15 years, and I'm working in the Gulf. It's very interesting discussion. I really appreciate the insight. And I was going to reserve it for the next panel, but I think because most of you are NGOs, this is more appropriate. Most of the tools we've seen are downstream. We are looking at how people can be moved in this direction or that direction. Any chance we go upstream? That is, we use the same data to see how we can design better policy or legitimize the groups who are designing the policy. Because policy making is three things. It's compliance, design, and legitimacy. And we have suffered from big, severe issues in the other two areas. So is the data you're collecting supports going upstream? Can you point me to some references that I can use? Because I do design. And do you think it's a legitimate question to ask? Very important. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman at the top, please.
Yes. Raghid Morabi, Rafiq Hariri University, Professor of Finance and Banking. We've been speaking within the context of third world countries with policy prescriptions, nudge and interventionist approaches that work. What about a first world perspective specific to the United States with proscriptive welfare programs, specifically food stamps? The current debate to this minute, to this second, is that food stamp users should not be buying soda, ramen noodles, candy. Now that touches upon, first of all, freedom of consumption, freedom to be a consumer, as well as even touches upon civil rights in some segments of society. So what nudge magic wand would you have in that case?
Thank you. The woman in the front.
Hello, my name is Heidi Laskari. I'm the Managing Director for Diversity and Inclusion and Partnerships in the Planning and Development sector at the General Sports Authority in Saudi Arabia. I guess I have two questions. One, in looking at your framework for developing a nudge sort of, a nudge project, I think one of the challenges we face mainly is what is that time frame that you're looking at? I established and ran an employment program for persons with disabilities in the government, and the amount of nudging that was done and the amount of experiments that were there that were turning over within 3 months. Didn't work, let's try something else. Didn't work, let's try something else. I think one of the challenges we found in trying to advise policymakers and being part of that process was that we need time. We need time to see this on the ground. We need time to actually really come back to you and legitimately say, evidence-based, it's worked, it hasn't worked, and it wasn't just a time factor. So we're seeing tremendous change overnight, literally, week to week. We walk into the office and it can be a completely different environment these days. So how do you run something like this in an environment that is so changing? This is one. Two, perhaps the definition of inclusion that we've adopted. I go to many sessions now, and we talk about inclusion within the SDG framework. And I was very excited about it initially, but I still feel it's very gender, it's female-male. For me, inclusion is persons with disabilities and other subgroups. So in our sports program, we're looking at the elderly who are completely absent in our Vision 2030 framework because it's such a youth-based program. So how do we include people who are older, mature? How do we include persons with disabilities and the dynamics that come? People talk about that group as one group, but the subdivisions and understanding behavior. In Saudi Arabia, persons who are deaf, the women and the men were taught separate sign languages for a long time. So even talking to the groups, the language that you use, the sign language interpretation, you had to use a different sign language when you're talking to females versus males. This has changed immensely in the past even 15 years. But, are we planning enough to really be inclusive? When I sit down with my partners at UN and other World Bank, we have this discussion immensely, disaggregated data. You know, I constantly see male and female, but once you start saying, well, anybody with disabilities here, they're absent. So how do we become more inclusive, particularly in programs like this, where we are inclusive of other subgroups that are more vulnerable?
Thank you. Yes. The lady.
Thank you so much to the distinguished panel and to Nudge Lebanon for organizing this very interesting event. My name is Fatima Sheikh. I'm the deputy rep for UNDP in Djibouti. I'm intrigued by the financial inclusion that Josh spoke about because I think the whole financial inclusion through cash transfer was based on a maybe it was not categorized as model of Nudge. It was basically based on conditional cash transfer, and that showed a tremendous trend in Africa where there was steady increase in schooling, also in reduction of gender-based violence, of like deeply culture invested practices like the FGM and others. So I was wondering why you use only, or maybe you didn't use only saving, but I saw your proxy only talked about saving rather than the general social behavior. The second question, which goes also to Daniel, which is basically, in all the researches, have you looked at something around the social determinants? Because I would assume that Nudge in a primary society is very different from a tertiary society where the community has evolved and there is different social fabric in terms of the social determinants of a decision making. And that has a huge influx in terms of the ability of influencing the behavior, whether from policymakers in a primary society. They're quite different in practicing policies and policy implementation. But in tertiary world or developed world, if you wish, from society perspective, they have a different approach to policy making. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to turn to the panelists, perhaps starting with Amara. Would you like to start?
In terms of the question raised at the top there about sort of looking at the upstream factors and how do we deal with that, I think a lot of what we try to do is to precisely look at that. You know, so how do we hear the voices of those that are not normally heard? And I think this is critical. You know, as I said, you can only understand someone's context or where they're coming from if you can walk a mile in their shoes, really. And so for us, it's about, you know, trying to look at what's important for policy making, but then also for those recipients or beneficiaries of that policy. Because I think often there's this disconnect. And so, you know, it's about citizen-centric policy making, but what does it actually mean? You know, it's about really trying to think through how do you almost connect the dots. So in the previous panel, we spoke about the academic realm versus government, and how do they speak to each other. So if I can use an example, we kind of have this idea in our head that academia is on one end of the spectrum, and then the policy or practitioners are on the other, and then the people are somewhere in between, right? And so for us, it's really about thinking through how do you connect the two in a way that's suitable for both sides. And so, for example, if I use a very practical example, so we would get an academic report that's 50 pages. But what does this actually mean? You know, like, what can you take from it? So if I'm going to one of my politicians and saying, you know, this is a fantastic report, it's 50 pages long, they will literally look at me and laugh, you know, because that doesn't make sense to them. They need to interpret what this means. What is the link between policy and academia, and how does that translate to the people? And you can only understand what people want by going to them. You know, it's sort of laboring the point, but I think that it's really critical to understand and bring all of those stakeholders together to understand the bigger picture about what is the problem that you're actually trying to solve. Because there's no sort of siloed approach or vacuum approach. So you have to take this sort of, and someone mentioned it earlier about taking a whole of society approach, which is a bit of a, you know, academic term, but I think it's so critical in determining what people need at the bottom. And sometimes they're not really at the bottom. It's just that we think that they are at the bottom. And it's really about connecting all of those dots and, you know, drawing that line right across to actually really come up with a responsive policy position.
I know I'm a moderator, maybe not supposed to add, but I'd like to add something here. I completely agree this idea of bringing together multi-stakeholder voices, and I think that there's an experimental pilot project done in the business school around anti-sexual harassment policies, which is very untraditional for this type of advocacy to emerge in Lebanon from a business school. But what we found, in speaking to Ragada's point about legitimization, bringing non-traditional legitimized voices to a conversation on gender inclusion or social inclusion or whatever was quite powerful, because then we were able to create groups of voices. We brought in the 17-year-old activist with piercings all over her body, with the head of the Naabit, the nurses, with the CEO, with more traditional people working in the area of gender, like from INGOs and so on, sitting them at the same table to think about what are the questions, both upstream and downstream, and how can we create common language of advocacy was quite powerful. So non-traditional voices to bring forward more of a legitimate conversation on inclusion, I think, just to add to what you were saying. So moving on, Daniel. Yeah.
Sure, I'll maybe leave some of them for, maybe I'll leave the kind of some of the discussions of inclusion and so forth to Jennifer, but I'll touch on a few of these questions. So on the upstream, it's come up multiple times, right, throughout the day, how do we influence policymakers and so forth and so on, and so just two quick reflections on that is, it's super important, but it's also super hard, especially using the tools that we normally use, which is RCTs. So if you just think from a pure sampling perspective, if you want to like randomize presidents or something like that, right? I mean, that's the extreme. But there's things you can do at kind of like, bureaucratic management levels where, there's some projects done in the States with management training that's a bit more behaviorally informed for people that are working in ministries and so forth. It hasn't been actually conclusive, unfortunately, but I think that's a space where there's a lot of untapped potential, like working with people within ministries that are implementing policy, but that's different than making policy. And I think there's a question about if you're within government. So when I was in government, it's not the role of the bureaucracy to influence policymakers, it's the role of the populace to influence policymakers, right? And so I think that's civil society, interest groups, and a different hat that I wear. I've done some work recently on kind of what works for influencing politics within the work of Oxfam, and so there's interesting literature around interest groups and kind of what's effective and so forth that I think, be happy to share some of that with you. And then I'll touch on the last question about kind of social determinants of decisions. And I think it's hugely important, right? And that's why kind of these peer effects and things work, but also work differently in different contexts, right? When we use them as a tool for intervention. But there's other social pressures that exist, if I understood the question well, that are determining the behavior. And I mean, the kind of reality is we're not going to change everything, right? We're not going to affect everyone. So there are really strong forces that are going to, that's why these effect sizes are a few percentage points, right? There's other things happening. So we have to be humble about how much can be done with each tool that we use in our toolkit. But I think also there's space there, right? Where both you can use it as a tool, you can use the social dynamics if you understand them well to intervene. But also there's places where we thought it was pure effects and it's not. So the commitment device I gave earlier where you make a public commitment, I'll save this money towards this goal. People have tried just texting instead, and texting seems to have the same effect just to remind people of their goal as having the big peer group in person that you speak to every week. So there's interesting questions where do you always need kind of the like physical presence of social pressure to be effective. So those are a few reflections. Just quickly on the food stamps, the FAFSA examples on enrollment were from the United States, so I tried to have some examples from that context, but I think that's a policy-making question. If you create a policy that says you can't do X with this money, like that's about influencing policy, and I think the role of behavioral scientists in policy or in bureaucracies is to say, these are the effects you're going to have. So sometimes people aren't aware of all the unintended effects of requiring people to recertify something every year, for example. Sometimes they're aware and they're doing it on purpose and they believe that this is the way we should engineer society, and then that, I think, is a different question.
Thank you.
Great. On food stamps, we have a whole project on food stamps. I'm not going to bore you all with the details of that now, so I'm happy to send you a project about uptake and usage of food stamps and all that sort of thing. And, we do a lot of work domestically, and we try to have our international work be a reflection of our domestic work, because there's a lot more in common than we might otherwise imagine, while nevertheless difference. We try to keep that perspective. time to develop a nudge question, I think, is interesting. Too bad we're not going the other order. I was going to punt that to Dan because of the SPST experience where, and this has been hinted at, I think, during the day, like you have on the one hand the very deep dive, we're going to use, ethnographic tools to get to the heart of the problem. We're going to really make this problem-driven and need-driven, and we're going to take all the time we need to understand the context and all that. Our work is more biased in that direction. We do sort of shorter, quicker stuff as well, but more biased, I would say, in that direction. The work of nudge units, by contrast, and I'll be corrected by Lori and Dan and others who have worked, and Amara, who have worked on nudge units within governments, from what I understand, tends to be more focused on getting quick wins, right? Like Z said earlier, and that almost and there's a number of reasons for that. I don't think we want to get into now, but that tends to be also problem-driven, but with a very different tool and a very different set of time requirements involved. So it could be done either way, right? And I think you should think about the trade-offs that are involved in either approach. Why not other outcomes? Just very quickly, happy to talk more about our specific study and why we didn't look at other outcomes, but the short answer is it's need-driven. So when we went to the field, what we heard from people is they wanted help saving their money. And so we just looked at savings. But you could imagine, with more money, more time, we could also measure downstream effects, like what did people actually do with that savings once they had accumulated it? That's an interesting question for the future. This was just a sort of initial pilot. And then on the nudging bureaucrats, this is like the theme of the conference, it seems, but a fascinating and important question. We touched on it a little bit on an earlier panel. I would just say that there's a difference between nudging bureaucrats and nudging policy makers or people at the political level, right? And on the latter, so there's very little evidence on both of these things, I should say. But there's even less evidence on the policymaker sort of top-level question, probably because they're just harder to study, like you said. But there is some interesting things that are now coming out. So I just met Joshua Kurtzer at Harvard, who's got some interesting work. Kurtzer, K-E-R-T-Z-E-R, who's got some interesting stuff on nudging parliamentarians and other stuff like that. So this is really frontline stuff. And again, the sample size problem and all that, it's just difficult to reach these people in a way that's measurable. So it's tough. But I think there's more hope on the bureaucracy. Why? Because not just because there's more of them, but also because they do more routine tasks that lend themselves more to systematic biases that we have the tools to correct for. And we are now starting a project looking at how we can get government bureaucrats to respond more effectively to complaints when citizens submit them. So in most US cities and also a bunch of cities in Latin America and elsewhere in the world, including a couple even here in the Middle East, you have platforms that allow citizens to submit complaints, like 311 hotlines, for example, or apps or websites. And the question is, what happens on the back end? What do the government bureaucrats do in order to effectively respond? And it turns out that there's a number of things that we think could be done to improve how that all happens, and we're going to be testing those hopefully over the next year or so with the Hewlett Foundation. So there's hope.
In terms of hope, I'll pick up on that. I guess for us, we do look at behavioral insights in the context of kind of public sector innovation more generally. And as I mentioned at the outset, we have these, kind of different methodologies that we use to better understand what the problem is and what perspectives are from the people who are most affected by these challenges. So taking a very expansive view of experts, what experts mean. So not those sitting in the Capitol, not those sitting only in academia, but really those who live day to day what these issues are. And I guess that's our best safeguard against being exclusive and not understanding the issue properly. And using Agenda 2030, to answer your question about how to be inclusive, using Agenda 2030 as a platform to be able to reach out to these audiences at the periphery, at the margins, and bring them into the process of development. Oftentimes the Agenda 2030 is seen as UN's agenda or maybe a government's agenda, and we very much try to push it, kind of flip that and say that, no, it's our agenda. It's a citizen's agenda, and there's a certain responsibility that citizens could take to hold their governments accountable to that agenda. And we're trying to help with that. many of the groups that you mentioned, so whether it's people with disabilities or the elderly, whether it's unemployed youth, a little bit we're promoting the agenda, but we've identified in these different contexts priorities with our national partners based on their national development priorities, so looking at these issues of violence. And I guess the other thing I'll say, and this relates to the policy question, is that it's always, or almost always, in conjunction with a national partner, because the idea is that these behavioral insights, or the randomized control trials, should inform policy and should lead to improved policy, whether it's around gender-based violence with the National Council, the National Council for Women in Egypt, or Sudan's National Commission for Countering Terrorism. What we're finding out from this, we're hoping does lead to better policy, and they're kind of walking arm in arm with us. Well, it's their initiative, in fact, and we're supporting them on that. So we're hoping that there's a very tight connection between what we're doing on BI work and policies that we're seeing. And just the last question about the timing, like, do we have enough time to figure out whether something is working? I guess I just say I feel the pain in that we actually we all talked about this over the course of the day, is that there's a lot of time that needs to be spent on the upfront design of it. So before you can even get to the result and figure out whether it's working or not, we might have a change in government, or we might have a change of sponsor before we've even been able to design and implement it. And as Fadi well knows, we've been, in one of our countries, we've been talking for months and months and months about how to actually get the thing, get the trial up and running. And so we haven't had the luxury yet to have it running. So we're still working on that, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And I guess can I go to a closing remark?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll go to a closing remark. And that is to make a plea to the behavioral insights community to share as broadly and as loudly as you can around the kinds of work that you're doing, the experiences that the different trials that you see, the successes and the failures, because we need this to be able to advocate with our national partners to try this as a new methodology. Many of our national partners are severely allergic to the word experimentation, and to show that behavioral insights is not a scary thing, and that in fact it's a very constructive way of thinking about making policy and making change.
Thank you. So 1 minute concluding remarks as well to follow up. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that.
Great. I don't think I have anything to say, but because you said something, Jennifer, I'll return a plea, perhaps, as someone who's trying to develop scalable interventions for organizations that have access to these channels that reach governments and policymakers, and can help, accompany the governments in making those decisions, is help the community understand where the levers are for scale and what the uptake mechanisms are. Because it's one thing to sort of talk about it as loudly as one can. It's another thing to target it in as specific and frame it in as specific and narrow way as needed to make a decision happen. So we look for your advice on doing that.
Daniel?
Well, thanks to everyone that was on the panel. It was super interesting sharing it with you, and for the great questions. So my last reflection will actually be a little bit of a promotion. So Jennifer's team at UNDP and Nudge Lebanon we're developing, and I'm lucky enough to be a part of this, we're developing a report, kind of a guidance document on the sorts of behavioral tools you might use in the context of prevention of violent extremism, especially kind of building resilience against it, right? So not necessarily the hard end of the stick, but kind of the resilient end of the process. And so we hope that that's something that's useful to others. It kind of highlights some ways to approach it, right? It's very much exploratory, and so anyone that has others and has feedback, again, share loudly, share widely.
Yes, thank you.
I think just from my side, I think the panel has sort of said most of the things that I wanted to say, so thanks very much for that. But just to say that, for us, behavioral insights is one of the tools, to really think about how to influence a policy agenda. And so, but I'm saying one of the tools, so it's not the only tool. So just, when using the tool, and even some quarters within my own government, there is a level of skepticism in terms of how effective behavioral insights can actually be. But like sometimes life is difficult, and so you have to sort of ride that wave of skepticism and test and trial and see what works and what doesn't work, because it doesn't necessarily mean that because you think it's not going to work, that it's actually not going to work. And what behavioral insights and working with working within the field has really taught me is that there's always going to be a surprise, at some corner. And you just never know what you're going to get or what you're going to see or what you're going to observe. So it's really been, I'm not a behavioral scientist by background at all. But what it has taught me is that you are able to test and trial before you actually go into the field. Like, how fantastic is that? So without actually making a policy which sits on a shelf, you're actually able to test that and see what can work as opposed to what should work.
Wonderful. And with that, we thank the panelists for being here and the wonderful audience, and Nudge Lebanon for this great day, great 2 days. So thank you.